This is a good PC. It's not quite cutting edge. The CPU and GPU are both previous gen, but are still more than capable of gaming in 1080, perhaps even 1440. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this is one of the best price to performance PCs I've built this year. As a console killer, it's... You may have noticed that I have something of a preoccupation with the idea of console killer PCs. When I got back into the PC enthusiast scene about 5 years ago, it was mainly because of YouTubers making console killer build guides, and since then the console killer concept has always been the star I've steered my PC builds by. If one of my gaming PCs costs the same as a console, it needs to perform as well as a console. If it costs more, it needs to be worth it. Matching the 9th generation this early on was always going to be an optimistic goal, and of course the Scalper pandemic has only made things worse. But for this build, I've made what I hope are reasonable compromises. I've tried to keep my component selection as close to the specs of the consoles as possible, either in specifics or in spirit. For the processor, I chose the Ryzen 5 3600, purchased used from eBay for £155, including the cooler. Like the consoles, it is based on Zen 2 architecture, but unlike the consoles, this CPU only has 6 cores to work with. A Ryzen 7 3700X would have been closer to parity with the consoles, but at a cost of an extra £75 to £100, it doesn't represent great value right now. If in future titles 8 cores were to become a necessity, this would prove to be a relatively simple upgrade, but for now this is a corner I think it's safe to cut. In terms of memory, both consoles have 16 gigs of GDDR6 that can be addressed either as RAM or VRAM. The graphics card I've selected for this build has 8 gigs on board, so we only need another 8 gigs of system RAM to match the consoles on paper. Unfortunately, it never quite works out that way. Many modern games, including, for example, Call of Duty Warzone, run noticeably more smoothly with more than 8 gigs installed, so I decided to pay the £20 premium and picked up this 16 gig kit of Corsair Vengeance used for £55. Graphics cards are a difficult topic to talk about on the internet today, and I don't need to tell you guys how hard they are to find. On paper, a direct console equivalent would be an RTX 2080 Super, 3060 Ti, or RX 6700 XT, but any one of these would cost more than my entire budget for this PC in May 2021. My budget will accommodate this, an X-Demo Gigabyte RTX 2060 Super I picked up a couple of months ago for £310. It performs really well at 1080 in everything I've tested so far, and even at 1440 it will likely be sufficient for many people. It also packs in Nvidia's latest proprietary tech like hardware accelerated ray tracing and deep learning super sampling, which means we have at least feature parity with the consoles and a distinct advantage in image quality when running DLSS compatible games below native resolution. However, I think I shouldn't expect the 2060 Super to have the horsepower to match the Series X head to head, and if this PC has an Achilles heel, this is it. For storage, I chose a 1TB Samsung 870 QVO SSD that cost me £85 and came with a free Ubisoft game key, which may or may not be the only reason I bought the drive. I was torn between Immortals and Watch Dogs Legion, but the idea of an authoritarian Britain seemed like a nice bit of escapism, so look forward to seeing that one in the benchmarks. As it is, the SATA SSD is significantly slower than the PCIe 4.0 drives found in either console. As both Xbox and PS5 are doing exciting things with game switching and level streaming that have yet to show signs of appearing on PC, there's a disadvantage in software already that spending more on hardware isn't going to fully overcome. LTT's blind tests have proven most users can't tell an NVMe drive from a SATA drive in regular use, so I'm satisfied that there isn't going to be a real detriment to performance here. For the rest of the system, I've kept things budget yet preem. The case is a Techware Forge M, a fairly lightweight but good looking and nicely featured M80X case with a hinged tempered glass side panel, mesh front and 4 supplied ARGB fans for excellent airflow. The motherboard is a Gigabyte B450M I picked up used for £36 and that already had a Windows 10 license linked to it. The motherboard has overclocking functionality, but I doubt the stock cooler will be up to that particular challenge. Finally, everything's being kept fed by an EVGA 600W PSU I picked up on clearance for £40. This power supply is 80 plus certified, and given an estimated system power draw of about 400 watts, we have some overhead for future upgrades. All in, we're looking at a total build cost of under £750. This is going to be generally pretty tough to emulate right now, but not impossible. I am, of course, ignoring the aesthetically divisive elephants in the room. Console availability is improving, and even though getting them for their £350 to £500 retail price still isn't guaranteed, it looks as though Scalper prices are down to £600 or lower. In order to justify its £150 premium here then, this PC needs to not only offer the better functionality that PCs bring, but to do so without compromising on the gaming experience. The games I'm testing on this attempted murderer PC are next-gen titles. Either they are exclusive to the new platforms, have been enhanced for the new consoles post-release, or technically exist across generations but aren't realistically an option for older consoles. As both PS5 and Xbox Series X are promoted as 4K capable, whether or not they're actually rendering 4K internally, I'm going to try and match their output resolution wherever possible. For capture, I'm doing a second run of each game using Shadowplay to capture the crispy 4K goodness, which YouTube will then crush into oblivion, but that's life, I guess. I'm not going to compare esports titles or competitive shooters like Rocket League or Fortnite. For one, anyone serious about these games doesn't give a flying fuck about 4K, ray tracing, or even shadows. If you need specific numbers on those games, I have a separate video on the RTX 2060 Super in which I benchmark Warzone, Fortnite and others using a slightly lower spec PC, linked in the card above or in the description below. Anyway, enough talk. Control's 9th gen console version has been well documented thanks to the efforts of Digital Foundry. Developers Remedy have provided DF with a guide to matching console settings on PC. In normal mode, the game is capped to 60 FPS, though is known to dip below this. In ray tracing mode, the cap is dropped to 30, and frame pacing is much more consistent. Both modes run at a render resolution of 2560 by 1440. I did a few runs on the PS5 equivalent settings without ray tracing enabled, and saw an average FPS of 70, with 1% lows dipping to the mid-40s. With ray tracing turned on, the average comes in at 33 and 1% lows of 26. Interestingly, running DLSS at an internal resolution of 1080 didn't really save us here. I'd still argue that DLSS is the best option if you have this particular setup, and will be virtually indistinguishable from native 4K, but you won't find a great improvement in smoothness by doing so. As I write this, Cyberpunk 2077 has yet to receive its official next-gen release, though the 8th gen version was already programmed to leverage the added power of Series X and PS5 from day one. Thankfully, this means I don't have to benchmark with ray tracing enabled. I say thankfully, as without RT I was actually reasonably successful at matching the console performance. Consulting the Bible of Digital Foundry once again, I can see that Cyberpunk on Series X gives a choice of 60 FPS at 1080 or 30 FPS at what is about 3200 by 1800. Using the resolution scaler to run at 1800 and high settings, I saw an average of 31 FPS with lows of 24, and at 1920 by 1080 with some tweaks I managed to just scrape under 60 FPS with lows of 47. With DLSS I got even smoother results while keeping the visuals nice and crispy. I think if I had to include RT in my tests, things wouldn't go quite so well with the PC, and I'd have to make some major compromises on image quality. The only information I had on Destiny 2's 9th gen update was that it was set to run at 4K 60 FPS in quality mode and 1440 120 FPS in performance mode. Also, from what direct comparisons I saw, it seems to be running at fairly low quality settings in order to achieve these FPS. The game also doesn't seem to feature DRS or dynamic resolution scaling, so it's more likely to drop below the target frame rate when things get tough. On the PC, with settings at medium, I was able to match these settings pretty closely, at least during the intro section. Averages hit just shy of 60 FPS at 4K, and 120 FPS in 1440, though there were some substantial drops in 1% lows in each run-through. Comparing Dirt 5 has proven challenging. On console, the game has 3 distinct modes with very indistinct differences. One mode prioritises quality settings, another prioritises pixel count, and the last prefers FPS. During my testing, alas, I wasn't able to consistently match any of them. Quality mode on console runs at 60 FPS between 1440 and 2160, with DRS meaning it frequently drops closer to the low end of that range in order to maintain higher LODs, texture filtering, and ambient occlusion. Resolution mode drops these settings in order to stick closer to 2160. I managed only an average of 50 FPS trying to emulate either of these modes, with resolution mode winning slightly on minimums. Console performance mode aims for 120 FPS frame rate by sacrificing both resolution and quality settings, running between 900 and 1440 with reduced details and effects. In trying to do the same, I only managed an average FPS of 100 with lows of 90. If I were playing this game on this PC just for my own enjoyment without feeling the need to match the consoles, I'd be aiming for 1080 or 1440 with high settings, which should certainly come in over 60 FPS. The first major cross-platform title to feature ray tracing support, Watch Dogs Legion on console runs with dynamic resolution scaling between 1440 and 2160 at a capped 30 FPS. As the PC version lacks DRS, I did a little bit of experimentation and found that at 65% scaling, high settings with medium RT, I could hit an average of 25 FPS with lows of 19. With some tweaking of the scaler, I dare say this could reach a solid 30, but of course I have the DLSS trick up my sleeve. Switching out the resolution scaler for DLSS balanced, averages jumped to 35 and 1% lows to 25. By dropping further to DLSS performance, I saw FPS increase to 41, though still failed to stay consistently above 30. Of course, I'm not 100% matching the console settings here, but I wasn't without DLSS either. According to Alex Battaglia, Series X and PS5 use some lower quality RT settings, which a PC user doesn't have access to via the menu. Apparently there is a way of applying the exact console quality settings to PC, but I've yet to find the relevant config files. If anyone knows where they're hidden, let me know in the comments. Well, I finally did it. I actually played some Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a game I've owned for about 6 months. Going into this, I knew we were probably going to struggle to match consoles here. Valhalla had been shown to run better on AMD graphics hardware, so this Nvidia GPU is starting at an immediate disadvantage. This showed when trying to match performance mode. DF's testing measures resolutions between 1440 and 1728, or 66 and 80% of native 4K at 60 FPS. After using some claimed PS5 equivalent settings I found online, dropping the resolution scaler to 60% and setting anti-aliasing to low, I saw an average of 62 in the canned benchmark, but 1% lows in the mid-40s. In matching quality mode, however, I was much more successful. At 100% of 4K, it scored an average of 40 with 1% lows of 30. In gameplay, this translated to a reasonably solid 30 FPS, with an occasional frame time spike spoiling things slightly. I like featuring the medium as it's a title that actually uses next-gen level technology to do something different. Its graphics aren't the most mind-blowing out there, but the rather unusual gameplay aspect of controlling the same character in 2 differently rendered viewports simultaneously often proves too much for weaker GPUs. Console versions use a 30 FPS cap and dynamic resolution scaling, along with ray-traced reflections. DF's video claims to have measured a resolution range varying from full 4K down to as low as 1600 by 900. On the PC we don't have access to that same range of scaling, with the low end of DRS only dropping as far as 50%. With that limit enabled and the FPS capped at 30, I got a pretty playable experience, though far from smooth frame times. As I expected from previous benchmarks, performance tanked during certain effects-heavy scenes and in transitions from the real world to the spirit world. Ray tracing didn't have a massive impact on performance, except specifically in an early scene with a motorcycle helmet that caused the PC to act like it was having a stroke. Okay, I feel I need to explain this one. You see, I was looking through Push Square's list of games that had been given a free PS5 upgrade, and happened to notice For Honor on there, sticking out like a gangrenous thumb. This 2017 title that I'd actually forgotten I own is apparently still popular enough that the developers saw fit to do an update for the 9th generation. Again, I couldn't find any more detailed information about the game's quality settings on console other than 4K 60, so I may not be comparing apples to apples here. But in my test at the new extreme quality setting of 4K, I saw an average of just 48 FPS during the first story level. Dropping quality to medium saw a frame rate closer to that of the consoles, and of course dropping the resolution would have the same effect, but this is apparently still a way short of what a console gamer is experiencing. I think I'm going to have to call bullshit on Crytek's quality claims on PS5 and Xbox Series X. DF's characteristically in-depth examination of Crysis Remastered shows that neither console is achieving anywhere near the claimed 4K resolution in quality mode. Even the more optimistic estimates of 1440 and 1800 are pretty far off. In native 4K, using high settings with certain CPU-intensive features turned to medium, as per DF's recommendations, I saw an average FPS of 36. Dropping to 1440p, that figure increases to 67.5, and adding ray tracing at high quality puts us just below 60. However, I imagine later sections with more reflective surfaces and complex lighting would probably see that dip further. Trying out DLSS in 4K didn't help a great deal, with neither quality nor balanced modes reaching the same FPS as 1440 without DLSS, suggesting either the render resolutions are still too high or the processor is holding us back. Rounding things off with Jedi Fallen Order, and performance in general gameplay here is pretty much on par with what's offered by the 9th gen consoles. In quality mode, the PC can run at full 4K with epic settings at an average FPS of 35. Drop that resolution to 1440 in order to match performance mode, and the FPS climbs up to 68. The disappointing factor is the minimums, and this is apparently not a PC exclusive feature. Usually a pre-scripted scene or cutscene will bring with it some horrendous frame time spikes that definitely feel out of place in a modern game running from an SSD. On the positive side, as I was editing this video, Respawn announced another next-gen update soon. I hold on to some hope that this update will contain a fix for this stutter, as it seems like a pretty good game otherwise. I don't think I have a very solid conclusion to offer here. I could talk about how it scores in Cinebench or 3D Mark, or how it absolutely shreds in Fortnite or Warzone, but that wasn't the point of the build. The point was whether a £750 PC built during the Scalper pandemic of 2021 was good enough to call a 9th generation console killer. And the answer to that is no. And possibly yes. While looking through the benchmarks, something struck me. I'm not really doing scientific tests here. I mean, I never am. Not really. I'm no Gamers Nexus after all, but I'm not comparing apples to apples. I'm not locking my variables before I start counting frames, because consoles don't play by those rules. If an Xbox or PlayStation wants to run a game at 900p and tell you it's 4K, it will. It uses all the temporal anti-aliasing and checkerboard rendering tricks in the book to fudge the fact that it's not actually 4K, and in response, I'm doing the same thing. This PC can't deliver 60 FPS at true 4K with ray tracing enabled in 2021, and I'd be willing to bet no other £750 PC could either. By moving the goalposts, we can get an experience that comes close to that of the Series X and the PS5. Maybe it won't be close enough for you, maybe it will. Maybe nobody will notice. I'm sure there's going to be a diversity of opinion on this, and I'm sure you'll let me know yours in the comments. This is actually going to be the first of a series on the topic of console killers this month, and it's not just going to be PC builds. If that sounds like your thing, subscribe and hit the bell to see when they go live. While you're there, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.